We are launching into an examination of a device that has really permeated our culture, our security systems, and even our courts, yet it remains just shrouded in controversy.
Hmm.
We're going to take a close look at the history, the mechanics, and most importantly, the established scientific standing of the polygraph, a device that's often, and as we'll see incorrectly, called the lie detector.
And we really have to start right there with that fundamental misnomer. The core paradox of this machine is that while it's used in these incredibly high-stakes environments, we're talking national security, criminal investigations.
Right, the most serious situations.
Exactly. But major scientific and governmental bodies, they classify it as fundamentally pseudoscientific.
Wow.
Strictly speaking, it's a device designed to do one thing: measure and record involuntary physiological indicators. Things like blood pressure, your pulse, your breathing rate, and skin conductivity. That's it.
So the whole assumption, the foundational belief that drives its entire existence, is that a person who is lying will experience some kind of measurable surge in these indicators.
Yes.
A surge that's unique to deception.
That is precisely the theory. The problem is, and this is the finding that really challenges the whole framework, there are no specific, measurable physiological reactions that are uniquely or, reliably associated with lying. The polygraph simply cannot isolate a deception signal.
What it can measure, then, is arousal. I think we have to establish that right away for you, the listener.
Yes.
This machine can't tell the difference between the anxiety someone feels because they're lying about espionage and the anxiety they feel because they are just terrified of being hooked up to a machine in this high-stakes, stressful room.
And that could be amplified by anything: pre-existing anxiety, nervousness, even prescription medication.
Of course.
Exactly. It mirrors the body's sympathetic nervous system response, that classic fight-or-flight activation. And that response is a generalized, non-specific reaction to stress. The science is deeply skeptical, yet this technology, it powers a massive industry, and it remains entrenched in these high-stakes fields.
So our goal in this discussion is to really uncover what the scientific verdict is, and then explore why, despite all this deep skepticism, it's still so extensively used in government security and law enforcement all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's unpack the actual procedure. So if you were required to take one of these tests, maybe for a job or as part of a legal investigation, what would that session actually look like? It's much more complex than just, strapping on some sensors and asking questions.
Oh, it's a highly formalized, very structured procedure. It's designed to optimize the conditions for measurement, which, let's be honest, often means optimizing the subject's anxiety.
Right.
The session always begins with a lengthy pre-test interview. This is where the examiner gathers all the background information on you and, crucially, establishes the ground rules and the narrative. They'll spend a significant amount of time talking about the machine's supposed accuracy, really emphasizing that it can detect any lie.
So that phase is less about gathering facts and more about psychological priming.
It's an explicit attempt to make the subject believe the machine is infallible, whether they're guilty or innocent.
And that seems to lead directly into this specific psychological tool they often use, the STIM test.
Yes, the stimulation test. The subject is asked to deliberately lie about something completely trivial.
Yeah.
Maybe you pick a card or you name a random number. Then the tester, using a specific technique, detects this intentional, harmless lie.
They might even know the lie beforehand to make sure they get it right.
Absolutely. The goal is twofold. First is to increase a guilty subject's perceived risk of deception, hopefully making them more anxious when the critical questions come.
And
Second, it validates the process in the subject's mind. But as we just said, the moment you start cranking up the anxiety, you potentially corrupt the whole test for an innocent person. The sources point out this serious risk that an innocent subject who's already nervous about the outcome might actually become more anxious than a guilty person.
a guilty person who maybe believes they've mastered lying or evasion. Okay, so once that psychological stage is set, you move to the physical hookups and the actual questioning. What exactly are the sensors measuring on the body?
There are typically three main components connected to the machine. You have what are called pneumographs. These are two rubber tubes that get wrapped around your chest and abdomen to measure your breathing patterns. They're looking for changes in breathing rate or if you're holding your breath.
Okay.
Then you have the blood pressure cuff, often called a cardiosphygmograph. It's inflated to measure your pulse and blood pressure, looking for cardiovascular spikes.
And the last one.
And finally, you have electrodes attached to the fingers. This is the galvanic skin response, or galvanometer. It detects very subtle changes in skin conductivity. Basically, it's measuring how much you're sweating.
So the machine records these changes, and the examiner then has to interpret these tracings. The most common technique, especially in the US, is the control question technique, or CQT. Can you explain how that system is supposed to work?
The CQT is essentially a comparison game. It alternates between three categories of questions. First, you have irrelevant questions, which are completely benign and used to get a physiological baseline.
Like, is your name John, or are you sitting down right now?
Precisely. Second, you have the relevant questions. These are about the crime or whatever's being investigated, like did you access the classified files? And third, and this is the critical component, you have the diagnostic or control questions.
And how are these control questions different?
They are deliberately broad, kind of vague questions about past behavior that almost everyone would have trouble answering truthfully, or at least feel uneasy about.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Something like, have you ever lied to someone who trusted you? Or, before the age of 25, did you ever do anything illegal? The subject is almost compelled to give a known lie, or at least a highly generalized, stressful answer to these control questions.
So the whole key, passing or failing, it relies entirely on the comparison between the physiological peaks you get from those stressful but minor control questions and the peaks from the truly critical, relevant questions.
That's it. The CQT model suggests that if you are innocent of the relevant crime, your physiological response to that ethically loaded control question will be larger, because that is what's truly bothering your conscience.
But if you're guilty,
If you're guilty, the question about the specific crime will be the peak stressor, causing a bigger response than that generalized control question.
it just seems inherently vulnerable. I mean, that comparison is so susceptible to how the questions are framed and just how intense the whole interrogation feels. The critics note that the CQT can be conducted in an interrogation-like fashion, which is almost guaranteed to make anyone nervous, innocent, or guilty.
The psychological dynamics are inherently biased, and that structural tension has led some polygraphs proponents, and even some researchers, to favor an alternative technique. It's known as the guilty knowledge test, or GKT. Sometimes it's called the concealed information test.
And that's the method they prefer in countries like Japan, right?
It is.
So what's the fundamental change with the GKT, and why do some people think it has more theoretical validity?
The GKT completely shifts the goal. Instead of trying to catch a lie, which is so problematic because of the whole lying and anxiety link, the GKT tries to detect whether the subject has crucial, specific information about the crime that only the guilty person would know.
Information that's been kept from the public.
Exactly. So the administrator doesn't ask, did you steal the money? They ask a series of questions where only one answer contains that guilty knowledge.
So it's multiple choice.
Exactly. For example, if a unique item was stolen, the questions might be, was the stolen item a watch, a ring, a bracelet, or a rare coin? Only the correct answer is the item that was actually stolen.
And what's the machine theoretically measuring in response to that correct, concealed piece of information?
This is where the theoretical validity gets a bit stronger. The GKT relies on something called the orienting reflex. It's a primitive, involuntary psychological reaction we all have to new, significant, or important stimuli.
So you see something you recognize, and your body reacts without you thinking about it.
That's the idea. If the subject has concealed information, their brain will recognize the correct choice among the others, and that recognition triggers an involuntary orienting response, which is then measured as a spike in the physiological indicators. And because this test is often administered by someone who doesn't even know the correct answer, it's designed to be less prone to the interrogation bias that plagues the CQT.
But even with these structural advantages of the GKT, we still have to turn to the cold, hard scientific verdict on the technology as a whole.
And the consensus across the scientific community is pretty damning. The American Psychological Association states that the vast majority of psychologists agree there is little evidence that polygraph tests can accurately detect lies. This isn't just a philosophical objection. It's based on decades of rigorous examination.
This skepticism has a long official history in the U.S. government itself. We can trace major official doubt all the way back to 1983 with the U.S. Congress Office of Technology Assessment, or OTA. What did their early review find?
The OTA review was cautious but very pointed. They concluded there was only limited scientific evidence for establishing the validity of polygraph testing. And importantly, they issued specific warnings that high error rates were a definite possibility and that factors like the examiner's technique Differences among examinees and especially the use of countermeasures could just completely undermine any perceived validity.
So decades ago, they were already warning that the tool was easily corrupted and lacked strong foundational science.
Yes. But the ultimate judgment, the one critics always cite, is the 2003 review by the National Academy of Sciences, the NAS. This report didn't just question the validity, it challenged the foundational research the entire industry relies upon.
What did it say?
The NAS report, the polygraph and lie detection, it delivered a devastating critique. Their summary statement was that, overall, the evidence is scanty and scientifically weak. What makes this report so critical is that they didn't just review the existing data, they reviewed the quality of the studies that the polygraph industry itself was using to support their claims.
And what did they find about those studies?
They determined that 57 of the roughly 80 research studies that polygraph proponents had relied on to claim high accuracy rates were, quote, significantly flawed.
57 out of 80, that's a staggering number. What was the nature of these flaws in the foundational research?
Well, most of the flawed studies relied heavily on mock crime scenarios.
So fake crimes.
Fake crimes. In these setups, you have volunteers who are asked to commit a fake crime, then half are told to lie about it, and half are told to tell the truth. The problem is, subjects in mock crimes, they lack any genuine consequences. They know whether they're guilty or innocent, and they know the stakes are minimal.
So they don't experience the overwhelming fear, the risk of losing their job or going to prison. That would corrupt the physiological responses in a real-world high-stakes test.
Not at all. And by relying on data from situations without real consequences, the foundational studies significantly inflated the apparent accuracy of the device.
So if we strip away all that flawed research, what did the NAS actually find the polygraph could do?
There was a small caveat. The NAS did acknowledge that in very specific incident tests, when administered to subjects who were not trained in countermeasures, the polygraph could discriminate lying better than chance. But they immediately added the critical qualifier, well below perfection. And crucially, they stressed that this very limited finding cannot be generalized to the broader application of the polygraph.
And that leads to the critical distinction that applies directly to government use, screening versus specific incidents.
Absolutely. The NAS warned that polygraph accuracy for broader screening purposes, like vetting employees for highly sensitive government jobs, is almost certainly much, much lower, probably close to random chance and entirely insufficient to justify relying on it. The Moynihan Commission on Government Secrecy reiterated this, concluding the polygraph is neither scientifically valid nor especially effective beyond its ability to generate admissions.
This lack of consensus is reflected at the highest judicial levels in the U.S. The 1998 Supreme Court case, United States v. Sheffer, really summarized the whole debate over reliability.
In Sheffer, the majority opinion stated plainly that there is simply no consensus that polygraph evidence is reliable. The court made a key observation about the role of the polygraph operator, noting that unlike a scientific expert who testifies about hard facts like DNA or ballistics, a polygraph expert offers the jury only a subjective opinion about a subjective state arousal.
And it's hard to ignore the power of the Supreme Court's summary when they stated that its use was little better than could be obtained by the toss of a coin.
That statement just encapsulates the deep judicial mistrust. So we circle right back to the core flaw. The machine measures the intensity of your physiological response, how hard your heart is beating, how fast you're breathing, how much you're sweating. It cannot logically or physically differentiate anxiety caused by dishonesty from anxiety caused by the stress of being interrogated, fear of the machine, or underlying psychological factors.
You mentioned anxiety and fear, but what about other specific conditions that could influence the reading and lead to a false positive?
Oh, the list is long. Any condition that alters your baseline physiological state can skew the results. This includes generalized anxiety disorders, extreme nervousness, PTSD, depression, certain medications, or even the effects of substance use or withdrawal.
So someone with PTSD, for example, might react very differently.
A person with PTSD subjected to an aggressive interrogation style might show massive physiological spikes that are completely unrelated to the question being asked, leading to a false indication of deception. One professor of psychology and neuroscience, William Iacono, stated clearly that while the CQT might be useful as an investigative aid, it does not pass muster as a scientifically credible test and is actually inherently biased against innocent people because of the high rate of false positives.
And just quickly as we move on, the sources mentioned efforts to try and fix this by simply adding more data capture, right?
Yes, there were attempts, like the silent talker lie detector, to integrate cameras to film microexpressions during the test. The hope was that giving the human evaluator more physical data would improve accuracy.
And did it?
No. According to investigations, adding the camera was expensive, it was cumbersome, and it failed to improve detection rates. Because if the core measurement arousal is unreliable, just collecting more supplementary data on that unreliable process doesn't solve the fundamental scientific void.
So if the science is weak and the interpretation is subjective, the next logical question becomes, can the polygraph be deliberately defeated? The existence of reliable countermeasures is one of the most powerful arguments against the device's validity. Let's break down the two major categories of manipulation.
Right, if a test can be intentionally gamed, it's not a reliable security tool. The strategies for defeating the test are categorized based on whether they target the subject's overall emotional state or the specific physiological responses at the moment of the control questions.
Let's start with general state countermeasures, those focused on just maintaining overall calm. The classic high-profile example here is Aldrich Ames, the notorious CIA officer who passed 2 polygraph exams while spying for the Soviet Union and Russia. What was his strategy?
Ames's instructions, which he got from his KGB handler, were strikingly simple. They focused entirely on managing his demeanor and psychological state. The advice was, get a good night's sleep and rest, and go into the test rested and relaxed. Be nice to the polygraph examiner, develop a rapport, and be cooperative.
So the goal wasn't some complicated physiological trickery, it was just about controlling the emotional atmosphere.
Exactly. Ames later explained there was no special magic. The goal is just to reduce your overall background anxiety as much as you can, which minimizes your baseline arousal level. By being confident, relaxed, and establishing a friendly rapport, you minimize the difference between your state during the irrelevant questions and your state during the relevant questions.
If you're already near zero anxiety, a relevant question won't produce a big enough comparative spike to indicate deception.
That's the idea.
Now contrast that with specific point countermeasures, which are far more deliberate and involve active physiological manipulation at precise moments. This is where subjects are essentially trying to create a false positive on purpose.
That's right. Specific point countermeasures are aimed at the very mechanism of the CQT, that comparison between control and relevant questions. The subject tries to make their physiological response to the control questions artificially larger than their response to the relevant deceptive questions.
How does a subject achieve that artificial spike during the control phase?
Well, the strategy requires concentration and either self-inflicted pain or intense mental stimulation. First, you have to mentally record which questions are the control questions and which are the relevant questions during that pretest discussion. Then, when the control questions are asked, you introduce a deliberate stimulus.
What kind of stimuli are we talking about?
The sources indicate methods like using a pointed object concealed in your clothing, a thumbtack, a tack, or even a hidden pin, to discreetly prick yourself somewhere the examiner can't see, like under your buttocks or in your shoe.
Oh, wow.
The sudden, intense, self-inflicted pain triggers a massive, genuine physiological spike, a real jump in heart rate and blood pressure that gets correctly recorded by the machine. Alternatively, some subjects are coached to engage in intense mental exertion, like complex math calculations or vividly recalling a terrifying memory during that control phase.
So by doing this, they create this huge spike in arousal during the control question. Then, when the actual lie about the crime is asked, the relevant question, the physiological response, even if it's genuine, looks tiny by comparison. They pass because the control response looks bigger.
That is precisely the mechanism of defeat. And studies confirm that even basic training in these techniques can significantly reduce the accuracy of the CQT. This ability to intentionally skew the results is one of the primary reasons the scientific community just refuses to endorse the polygraph.
And beyond human manipulation, were there documented instances of technical flaws in the machines themselves that further eroded reliability?
Yes, there were. A McClatchy investigation documented a serious issue within the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA. Polygraph managers there were found to have ignored documented technical problems that were discovered in the Lafayette computerized polygraph system, which is a key tool used for routine counterintelligence testing across the U.S. government.
And the impact of those flaws is unknown.
The impact of those documented technical flaws, hardware or software glitches on the final analysis, is completely unknown. But the fact that the flaws were ignored Just adds another layer of unreliability and doubt about the integrity of the results.
Given that defeating the machine is so plausible, the U.S. federal government has taken some really aggressive action against people who actively teach these countermeasure techniques.
The response was extreme. Starting around 2013, the U.S. government began indicting individuals who were running schools or selling materials that taught people how to beat a polygraph test. They viewed this as a severe threat to national security screening.
And this led to huge investigations.
Huge. It led to expansive investigations involving up to 30 federal agencies, looking into nearly 5,000 people who had purchased books or DVDs on the topic. The government's willingness to dedicate enormous resources to prosecute those who reveal the machine's weaknesses really speaks volumes about how reliant certain federal institutions are on this technology. And despite the scientific flaws, the judicial skepticism, the known risk of countermeasures, the U.S. federal government and its associated agencies remain, by far, the biggest global users of polygraph technology.
By far.
Estimates reported by Wired magazine put the number at over 2.5 million tests given annually in the United States, primarily to government and public safety personnel. The reliance is enormous.
But when we look at the history of espionage, which is the exact domain these tests are supposed to safeguard, the polygraph seems to have produced some spectacular and catastrophic failures, what we'd call false negatives. Let's get into some of these high-profile spy cases.
The list of successful spies who beat the machine is sobering. You start with Aldrich Ames, the man who compromised countless CIA assets for the Soviet Union and Russia. He underwent and passed 2 periodic reinvestigation polygraphs, one in 1986 and another in 1991.
He passed while he was actively spying.
Actively spying. A Senate investigation later revealed that while he passed the 1991 test, there were initial deception indicators that were flagged, but they were never fully resolved or pursued by his handlers. The system basically prioritized the pass result over a deeper investigation.
That suggests that even when the machine does indicate something is wrong, the result can be dismissed if it just doesn't fit the expected narrative. Who else made it through?
Well, we have Larry Wutai-Chen, a translator for the CIA's Foreign Broadcast Information Service, who successfully spied for China for decades. Karl Kucher, a Czech intelligence officer who infiltrated the U.S. defense community. He also successfully navigated the polygraph. And significantly, Ana Belén Montes, a high-ranking intelligence analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency who spied for Cuba, she passed her counterintelligence polygraph test in 1994, even while she was actively engaged in espionage.
It's a profound irony. The tool designed to catch spies fails repeatedly to catch the most damaging ones. The sources even include a fascinating historical quote from Richard Helms, the former director of Central Intelligence, from 1978.
Yes, Helms noted a perceived cultural element. He said, "We discovered there were some Eastern Europeans who could defeat the polygraph at any time. Americans are not very good at it because we are raised to tell the truth. But we find a lot of Europeans and Asiatics can handle that polygraph without a blip, and you know they are lying." Now, whether or not that statement is scientifically accurate, it illustrates the high-level awareness that the test was unreliable. And yet, its use persisted.
While the failures are stark, we should contrast them with instances where the polygraph did flag a concern, even if it wasn't perfect.
The case of Harold James Nicholson is often cited by proponents. He was a CIA employee who became a Russian spy. During his periodic 5-year reinvestigation in 1995, he showed a strong probability of deception on relevant counterintelligence questions.
So it worked in that case.
It provided the necessary red flag that prompted the ensuing investigation, surveillance, and eventual arrest. So while it fails many times, it can occasionally serve as an indicator that necessitates further investigative action.
And then there's the deeply cautionary tale of Edward Lee Howard. This case perfectly illustrates the inherent rigidity of a system that trusts the polygraph too much.
Edward Lee Howard was a CIA employee being vetted for a sensitive overseas post. During his polygraph screening, he answered truthfully, admitting to minor prior offenses, specifically petty theft and past drug abuse.
So he told the truth.
He told the truth. But because the system was so rigid, he was dismissed immediately for these truthful admissions about minor crimes. Howard felt the dismissal was unjust and retaliated by selling highly sensitive CIA operational knowledge to the Soviet Union. The polygraph, in this case, successfully identified minor youthful indiscretions, but the subsequent bureaucratic action created a national security threat far greater than the initial crimes. It was a spectacular failure of judgment.
A failure stemming from over-reliance on the test.
Exactly.
Finally, we have to acknowledge the allegations of ethical misuse of the test within the security community itself. It can be used not just to screen for spies, but as a coercive interrogation tool.
A 2012 investigation by McClatchy brought forward serious allegations regarding the National Reconnaissance Office, the NRO. Former NRO polygraph examiners claimed the agency was encouraging them to breach ethical and legal boundaries by extracting highly personal and private information from employees during routine polygraph tests. Tests that were officially supposed to be strictly limited to counterintelligence matters.
So they were going way beyond the scope.
Far beyond. And these allegations highlight how the high-pressure environment of the polygraph room can be deliberately manipulated to invade employee privacy far beyond any real security needs.
Moving outside of the U.S. intelligence community and law enforcement, the polygraph is overwhelmingly considered an American phenomenon. Its extensive use is largely confined to the U.S., Israel, Canada, and Japan. How do the majority of other global jurisdictions treat polygraph results in their judicial systems?
The consensus internationally is one of deep distrust, bordering on outright rejection. In a majority of European jurisdictions, polygraph results are generally considered unreliable and inadmissible as evidence in court proceedings. They're rarely used by local law enforcement and are seen by many justice systems as potentially violating fundamental rights, like the right against self-incrimination or the right to remain silent.
And we see this reflected in specific judicial decisions across the Commonwealth and beyond.
Absolutely. The Supreme Court of Canada rejected the use of polygraph evidence in court in the case of R.V. Bayland back in 1987, stating clearly that it lacked the scientific credibility to influence a jury. Similarly, the results are inadmissible in court in places like New South Wales, Australia, and the Philippines. In Europe, the Supreme Courts of Germany and the Netherlands have also explicitly rejected their use as evidence.
So the results are out of court, but some countries still find utility in the machine as an investigative or monitoring tool, even if it can't secure a conviction.
That is the critical distinction many countries make. In Canada, for instance, even though the results are inadmissible in court, the polygraph is still used extensively as a tool during criminal investigations and for security screening of government employees.
So it's used to guide the investigation.
It helps guide where police resources should be focused or to generate admissions.
And we see a similar compromise in the UK regarding offender management.
Yes. In England and Wales, the government passed legislation, and by 2014, polygraph tests became compulsory for certain high-risk sexual offenders on parole as a monitoring mechanism. The goal is supervision and rehabilitation, not evidence gathering. If an offender shows deception, the authorities can adjust their probation conditions, but the result alone can't be used to prove a new crime in court.
Poland has a very specific legal carve-out, which really highlights the legal caution.
In 2015, the Supreme Court of Poland ruled that using the polygraph during the interrogation of suspects is explicitly forbidden by their Code of Criminal Procedure. However, the ruling allows for its potential use only after the suspect has already been formally accused of a crime, and only if that person provides full and explicit consent.
And even then, the results are just supplementary.
Strictly supplementary. They can never substitute for actual evidence required for a conviction.
Perhaps the most significant legal stand against compelled testing came from India, focusing on constitutional rights.
That 2010 landmark ruling by the Supreme Court of India was definitive. The court declared the forced use of several investigative techniques, specifically narcoanalysis, brain mapping, and polygraph tests on suspects, to be illegal and a violation of the Constitution. The ruling cited Article 23 of the Indian Constitution, which guarantees the fundamental right against self-incrimination.
And the court said it amounted to cruel and inhuman treatment.
It did. Cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. So unless the defendant willingly requests a test, the state cannot compel it. The court stressed that consent must be obtained and recorded meticulously. This stringent legal protection against forced testing just underscores the judicial distrust of any method that tries to compel physical reactions instead of voluntary testimony or demonstrable physical evidence. When we examine the history of the polygraph through the lens of criminal justice, the real-world human impact, especially where lives and freedom are at stake, is just devastatingly clear. We have to look at the cases where relying on the test led to these monumental failures of justice, whether through false negatives or false positives.
Let's focus first on the most catastrophic failures. false negatives that allowed violent offenders to walk free. One of the most haunting examples involves Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer.
Ridgway is a textbook example of a polygraph failure. He was interviewed early in the investigation, and he successfully passed a polygraph test back in 1984, convincing investigators of his innocence.
So they moved on.
They moved on. Meanwhile, police focused on other suspects, one of whom allegedly failed a polygraph test, leading to this prolonged, misplaced suspicion. It was only nearly 2 decades later that Ridgway confessed, after being confronted with irrefutable DNA evidence.
So for 2 decades.
The fact that a known, prolific serial killer successfully gamed or defeated the test meant he remained free to continue his crimes for many years. It was a profound failure of the technology to protect the public, and it's impossible not to feel immense sympathy for the victims and their families in this devastating miscarriage of justice.
Conversely, the trauma inflicted by false positives, where an innocent person is flagged as deceptive and falls under this intense, often public suspicion, can just destroy lives. The case of Bill Wegerle in Wichita, Kansas, stands as a chilling illustration.
In 1986, Bill Wegerle became the prime suspect in the murder of his wife, Vicki Wegerle, primarily because he failed 2 separate polygraph tests.
2 of them.
One administered by the police and another by a private examiner he hired to try and clear his name. Though he was never charged or arrested, that failure ensured he lived under a shadow of suspicion, with police resources focused on him rather than the true killer, for decades.
And he was eventually exonerated.
Completely exonerated, but only when DNA evidence conclusively linked the murder to the serial killer Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. That incident just underscores the severity of relying on a pseudoscientific test to cast suspicion on innocent people.
So if the scientific value is so low, why does it remain such a powerful tool in interrogations?
Its greatest utility, as noted by researchers and commissions alike, is its power as a psychological lever to extract confessions. The machine itself doesn't detect the lie, but the belief that the machine is infallible generates massive pressure.
And we see this in various high-profile cases.
Absolutely. Richard Miller, accused of espionage, was persuaded to confess largely because of his polygraph results combined with religious counseling. More recently, Christopher Watts was pressured into confessing to the murder of his family after failing a polygraph test.
And the case involving David Westerfield, connected to the disappearance of Daniel Van Dam, also fits this pattern.
Westerfield became the intense focus of the investigation after allegedly failing a polygraph test. The combination of the alleged failure and the surrounding media pressure created a situation of maximum scrutiny. In all these examples, the results are used as this dramatic, non-scientific tool to increase the subject's stress and vulnerability, compelling them toward admission, regardless of the test's actual accuracy.
And finally, the machine's dramatic tension has made it perfect for media entertainment, sometimes leading to tragic consequences.
Oh, we've seen polygraphs used extensively on talk shows for decades, turning personal issues, infidelity, minor theft into high-drama public confrontations. Shows like The Moment of Truth offered huge financial incentives for contestants to answer deeply personal questions based on polygraph results.
But the practice hit a low point with the Jeremy Kyle show in the UK.
Yes, the ethical nadir of this practice was the cancellation of that long-running program. It happened after a participant committed suicide shortly after failing a polygraph test administered on air, which led to a devastating public backlash and inquiry.
And the producers admitted they weren't even sure about the accuracy.
That's right. Producers later admitted in the subsequent investigation that they were uncertain about the test's accuracy, which just highlights the extreme ethical danger of weaponizing a pseudoscientific tool for entertainment purposes.
Before we conclude our examination, let's briefly explore the origins of the polygraph, which involves some truly fascinating figures. The history of lie detection is long, involving everything from ancient Chinese methods of chewing dry rice powder to medieval use of boiling water.
The modern quantifiable approach really began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso was measuring changes in blood pressure during police cases as early as 1895, and Vittorio Benussi was measuring respiration patterns in 1904.
But the figure often remembered today is William Moulton Marston, who focused specifically on systolic blood pressure. He really believed he had cracked the code and found a strong correlation between blood pressure spikes and lying.
Marston's legacy is truly one of historical contradiction and ambition. He was an intense advocate for his device, even publishing a book in 1938 and famously using the polygraph in advertising, claiming it scientifically proved Gillette razors were superior.
Really?
Yes. But despite his conviction, his systolic-only approach was ultimately insufficient, and his research was discarded by the scientific community.
However, he is arguably more enduringly famous for his contribution to popular culture than to science.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
William Moulton Marston is the creator of the iconic comic book character Wonder Woman and her lasso of truth, a fantastical weapon that compels anyone bound by it to tell the unvarnished truth. The creation of a magical device that could actually detect truth perfectly embodies the historical wish for the effective, scientifically reliable machine that Marston, through his early polygraph research, failed to invent.
The modern prototype we recognize today came from John Augustus Larson in 1921.
Larson, who worked for the Berkeley Police Department, created the device that first allowed for the simultaneous recording of both blood pressure and breathing. His work was then advanced by his protege, Leonard Keeler, who made two crucial additions in 1939. He added the galvanic skin response, the measurement of skin conductivity or sweat, and he made the entire device portable.
And that was the machine the FBI bought.
Keeler's combined portable machine was the prototype purchased by the FBI, and it remains the basis for the modern polygraph apparatus.
Given all we've discussed, the lack of scientific foundation, the persistent flaws, where is current research moving to genuinely address the need for reliable deception detection?
Researchers are actively shifting away from generalized physiological arousal to focus on neurological and cognitive activity. The most promising alternative involves functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI.
Looking at brain activity.
Exactly. Studies using fMRI show that when a person is actively trying to deceive, there is increased brain activity in specific regions of the prefrontal cortex areas linked to the inhibition of truthful responses. The theory is that deception isn't a simple lie, but a cognitive effort to suppress the truth, which fMRI can visualize. This may eventually provide the psychological correlation that the traditional polygraph completely lacks.
And there's another non-physiological approach mentioned involving reaction time tests.
Correct. Reaction time, or RT, tests, such as the relevant-irrelevant test, measure the speed of your response via computer, avoiding the need for those flawed physiological recordings. The idea is that a deceptive or suppressed response takes a measurable fraction longer to process.
But they also have limitations.
They do. Researchers note that subjects can still voluntarily control their reaction time, and deception can still occur within the response deadline, making them imperfect as well.
Finally, in a nod to the continued reliance on the technology, the U.S. Department of Defense has recently deployed a new algorithmic iteration of this technology overseas.
This is the Handheld Preliminary Credibility Assessment Screening System, or PCAS. It's a simplified device that captures less physiological information than a full polygraph, and, most importantly, it relies on a pre-programmed algorithm to make a decision, rather than relying on the subjective judgment and interpretation of a human examiner. It has been deployed for use specifically on non-U.S. persons in overseas locations. It represents the latest attempt to find an objective solution, even if that objectivity is based on an algorithm processing flawed measurements.
What we have seen in this examination of the polygraph is a deep, abiding paradox. We have a device whose origins blend early medical science with, comic book wish fulfillment that is almost universally labeled by scientists and legal experts as pseudoscientific. Yet this machine remains absolutely vital to judicial, security, and employment screening processes across the U.S. and many parts of the world.
The scientific record confirms the machine measures anxiety, not deception, and the history is just rife with examples of its catastrophic failure, allowing dangerous spies and killers to pass scrutiny, while simultaneously ruining the lives of innocent individuals who were flagged by false positives.
We hope this discussion encourages you to reflect carefully on the difference between measuring anxiety and measuring verifiable deception, especially when the consequences of a failed test are so serious and life-altering for people involved in criminal cases or seeking sensitive government employment.
So we leave you with this final, provocative thought to consider. Given the consistent documentation of the polygraph's failures in high-stakes espionage cases and the tragic instances of false positives that have caused irreparable harm to innocent people, how should modern governments ethically and practically balance the polygraph's known utility as an investigative tool that generates admissions versus its scientifically questioned validity?
Thanks for listening.